Hello everyone, this is Ron. Today I wanted to do a video about going from a BMW R9T to the bike I'm on now, a 1250 GSA. And the reason I'm doing this video is I see on the forums, Facebook for example, occasionally you get these questions, people asking what is it like on a GSA versus an R9T, and people are asking that question for a reason. So I just wanted to share my experience because that's exactly what I did. I had a 2018 R9T Classic, and it was the first bike that I had after taking a very long, almost 20-year break from motorcycling. And I decided to get an R9T is because the first bike I had back in 1977 was an old BMW, and when I saw the R9T I gravitated towards it, and it's a great bike. I really enjoyed it. I would describe the riding experience as stripped down and raw. It's a very fun bike to ride. And a little bit about myself. I am 6'2" and have a 35-inch inseam, so I'm a little big for that bike, I found out. It works, and like a lot of people, I had to make some changes to the bike. The seat was the first thing. As everybody knows, the stock seat on an R9T is very uncomfortable, and that was what I experienced. So I ended up very quickly getting a Mustang seat and also putting risers, specifically rock risers, the ones that adjust, and lower pegs to lower the stock pegs down about an inch, inch and a half, which is about the maximum you can do. So I did what I could on the bike, and eventually after the first season I also changed the rear suspension to an Öhlins, and that made a big difference as well. I had the bike on the track at one time, so I had a blast on it. The type of riding at that time, and pretty much still today, is what I'm doing right now. Is I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and there's a lot of roads, much like the one I'm at now, that are very close to my house where I live. So typically I would go out in the morning on a weekend and spend a couple hours on riding around. And the R9T, if that's all I did, it would be great. When I started getting longer days, and I would say the mileage, and again, this is for me personally, other people have different experiences. For me, I would say the limit was in that, believe it or not, that 90 or 100 mile territory. I would really start getting sore, even with the modifications that I made. Oh, we're coming up on a delay here. This road was washed out from the storms that we had here in the winter of 2022, and this is the first weekend it's open, and it's only open one way, so we're going to have to go through a controlled, there's going to be a stop signal up here, and we'll take a break. I'll come back in just a bit. Okay, so after about a little over a season on the R9T, my riding interest started to change, or evolve I should say, and I wanted to do distance riding, touring, and I had never, even when I was riding motorcycles back in the 70s, 80s, and to the mid-90s, it was always day riding. I never did any touring, but now I started having the desire to do that, and the R9T would be a problem, at least for me. I know some people say you can tour on it, and as they say, the best bike for touring is the one that you have. But you have to remember, I'm 6'2", and if that is like you, is is just not the greatest bike to tour on, and plus it being a naked bike, sure, you could add a fairing. There's things you can kind of do, but I started getting interested in a bike that's a little bit more set up for distance riding. And as opposed to going straight to the GSA, I actually got an Indian Springfield. So I had the R9T and the Indian Springfield at the same time, and I'm not a V-twin guy. The reason I bought the Springfield is because I just wanted to see what a V-twin was like and have an open mind, and I had it for 3 seasons. I'll do a video on that specific subject. And I took it on a few multi-day trips, had a blast, really enjoyed it. And when I was on those trips, there was times when I really wanted to pull off the road and go on dirt. Not far. I mean, I could see my destination, but that would be tough on a full-size V-twin touring type bike. So I started to think, like a lot of people, GSA. And so that's when I started researching more of the GSA, started thinking about it, and when I was on the third season of the R9T, and I had to get the last service before the warranty was up, my BMW dealer gave me a GS, I think it was probably a 2015 or 2016 GS as a loaner. And that was it. As soon as I got on the bike and got on the freeway, the difference was immediate. Now, they're 2 different bikes. I'm not comparing one's better than the other. It's just they're completely different machines. The first thing I noticed is on the freeway, being a bike that has a fairing and has that kind of beak front end, it cut through the wind like a hot knife through butter. Just a lot less effort on the freeway, and I can get up to speeds, say I can get to 90 or 100 and not even know it, whereas on the R9T, if you were going 90 or 100, it's a naked bike, you're gonna know it. So after that short experience, I decided I'm trading, and I put an order in for the bike I'm on now, which happened to be a GSA and not a GS. Took about 3 weeks to get because the dealer found one that it was in transit that nobody had a claim on. And I had it in about 3 weeks and did the trade. And I've had it now, this is the 3rd season I have had this bike, and I've had it on a few multi-day trips, some short, some as much as a week, and I'm going on a 3-week trip to Utah from California. So it's another way of saying is the touring aspect of it has been fantastic. So I really like this bike, but I want to talk about a few differences if you're thinking about switching from an R9T to a GS or a GSA. The first one, and I'm sure you're thinking about this, the first one is the height difference. This is a different type of bike. I am 6'2". I have a 35 inch inseam. I can flat foot this bike, but because it's so high up, is that the area beneath the bike where I could normally plant my feet if I was on the R9T is less and be flat-footed. So it took me a couple of weeks to get used to the height of this bike, and if you lean it over a bit at a standstill, you're going to know the weight. This is a heavy bike. And I nearly dropped it a few times. I eventually dropped it after a couple of months because I got a little bit too overconfident, and it's tough to pick up. You know, it takes some practice to pick this thing up. It's a heavy bike. So that's the first thing. It is a taller bike, and it does take getting used to. Once you're used to it, no problem, but you still have to respect the height and weight of this bike as compared to the R9T. The other thing to know, and this is a good one, is that not only is it a more comfortable bike to ride, it has a different front end. It has a telelever front end, and having that suspension up front reduces the amount of dipping, you know, dropping that the front end would do, dive, when you hit the brakes. And that, when you're going downhill on a curvy road, that is a big advantage. I really like having the telelever front end. It's a different type of feel. You don't get as much feedback as you do with telescopic forks, like you do on sport bikes, or R9T in this case, what we're talking about. Here's an area where the telelever front end is very noticeable, how the front end doesn't dive down. I'm going downhill, and the bike just really doesn't dive at all, as compared to the R9T or any bike that has telescopic. So for this type of riding, if you're going a distance, little things like that really help. Without, it doesn't, you don't get as tired. Oh, for God's sakes. The luggage and accessories in general are a lot more options available on this bike than the R9T, because that's what it's set up for. And then another thing that I was surprised about is a lot of people said that it's not a fun bike to ride. It's a very pragmatic machine, very sterile. And I don't know if I would agree with that, is because I actually enjoy riding this bike. It is different than the R9T. I would not say it has that, certainly does not have that raw feel, but looking at the bike before I even rode this, it was my assumption it was going to ride like a tank, and that is not the case. For the size bike it is, it actually performs surprisingly well in curvy roads. I'm not saying it's an S1000, but you would be surprised for the size bike it is. The other thing I will mention, if you're thinking of making the move, would you want to get a GS versus a GSA? And quite honestly, my opinion on that is I don't think it makes too much difference. If you get a good deal on a GS, or if I got a good deal on a GS, I would get a GS. I happen to have gotten a GSA because I wanted the stock racks, and I wanted the larger tank. I do not have to put 7.9 gallons in this tank if I don't want to. But the times when I've toured is when I do fill it up, I don't have to stop as often. That's kind of a nice thing. Is it a deal breaker? Absolutely not. It blocks the wind a little bit more, the large tank. Still not a deal breaker. So I quite honestly don't think the advantage or disadvantage of either is enough to be dedicated to one or the other. And I've ridden both of them. I've still had the opportunity over the past couple of years to ride two different GS's when this bike was being serviced, you know, the normal service. And I could notice a little bit of difference in the GS. It seems to be maybe a little bit more nimble on the freeway, but it's debatable. I didn't ride it long enough to see that there's enough difference to worry about if you're deciding between the two. The bike I found is also stock, pretty complete. There's not a lot of things you really need to do with it. Of course, there's a lot of accessories and a lot of things you can do, but that's going to become a factor of how you want to set it up. Once you take it on a few trips, you might want to change a few things. There is still going to be, like any bike, some ergonomics for the individual. Everybody's different. And I still put risers on this, and I put a different seat. It's not the stock seat, it's a Corbin seat. I had a custom made. I'm near the Corbin factory. I can go down there, I can make a custom one. Corbin seats are fantastic. So those are really the only two ergonomic changes I've made to the bike. I did put a little bit bigger windshield on it. That was not 100% necessary, but it helps a little bit in keeping some of the wind off. Some people like the wind. You would have to make that decision. But at the end of the day, do I regret switching to this bike over the R9T? No, not at all. I really liked the R9T, but it was more of an issue of comfort, and I could have held on to the R9T and this bike, but I did not want two boxer engines. I could only have two motorcycles, and my other bike right now is an S1000R, which I'll do a video on as well. But that was my reason for getting rid of the R9T, was more I just did not want two boxer engines. So a little bit too much of an overlap engine-wise. Another thing to be aware of is, since this bike sits high, is if you're parked and you're on uneven ground, or it's loose ground like gravel, and you need to back it up, it's not that easy. It takes a little practice, and I was just trying to do that today, and even though I could flat foot this bike, getting traction with the boot on a looser ground, again, the bike is heavy. You have to be aware of that. It's not like an R9T where you're much lower and you can get a lot more leverage and traction with your boot. That's something that takes a little bit getting used to. I will also mention that I don't have off-road skills. So if you have an R9T and you also have no off-road skills, thinking that going to a bike like this will open up another area of riding, well, it will if you get training. And even with training, this is a heavy bike, and it's a challenging handful off-road. Or I should say off pavement. I've had it off pavement a couple of times because I've had no choice. You know, there was a detour and I had to go a couple of miles on gravel, and it's tense. So I need to get some training so I can have more confidence. But do be aware, is this is not like having a smaller bike on the dirt. People that have adventure bike experience, big adventure bike experience, or even mid-size, would know this already. So I'm just mentioning this for people who are like me, who don't have off-road experience, thinking that if I move to this bike, I'm going to be able to go on, the Discovery backcountry roads. No, I'm not. Unless I want to crack up right away and not be able to lift the bike on my own. So I pretty much stay on pavement. I go off-road a little bit to get to a campsite, but it's minimal distance, a quarter of a mile, half mile, nothing. Something I could do on the R9T, actually. So I think this is a fantastic road bike, and an awful lot of people use it and don't even take it off-road like me. If you have any questions, please feel free to put the comments, and I'll try to answer those. And again, this is just my personal experience. Some people are fine setting up their R9T to do long distance travel. Some people are smaller. That would kind of make sense if that's the bike that you had. There are some people that said, hey, I'm 6'6" and I have no problem. That's great. It's all up to you what you feel comfortable with. So I would recommend, if you're thinking about going from an R9T to a GS or a GSA, if you can, take it for a test ride and decide for yourself. And let me know, if you do take it for a test ride, let me know what you thought.